The Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight will come to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's hearing titled Mismanagement of Funds at the National Weather Service and the Impact on the Future of Weather Forecasting. Today's hearing will consist of two panels you will find in the front of your packets containing written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for both of today's witness panels. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. As Vice Chair of the Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee, it is my pleasure to chair the hearing in Dr. Brown's place. We are here today to better understand what led to the mismanagement of funds at the National Weather Service. Our first panel will provide insight into how that mismanagement occurred, why there was insufficient oversight by department leaders, how the investigation was conducted, and the decisions and corrective actions that NOAA and the Department of Commerce will make going forward. Our second panel will provide context for how we got in this situation in the first place. We will hear from the National Weather Service Employees Organization about the stresses on labor funding and staffing, as well as the National Academies of Science about their recent report on how to plan, deploy, and oversee future improvements at the Weather Service, specifically the need to integrate advances in science and technology. Congress's appreciation of the value of the National Weather Service is evidenced by its financial commitment to it. Since 2007, Congress has exceeded the administration's request for the National Weather Service in all but 2 years, including 2011 when this Congress had to move to a CR 6 months into the fiscal year. So when Congress is informed that the Weather Service has been experiencing a budget shortfall for several years, we are understandably concerned. Keeping Congress in the dark while there's a storm brewing at the agency is at best irresponsible and at worst dishonest. We have also been informed that no NWS employee committed fraud or received personal financial gain through their actions. Yes, I'm glad that no one stole money for personal gain, but make no mistake, Congress's trust, my trust, has been violated. Money designated for programs like the Advanced Weather Interactive Processing System and Weather Radio Improvement Projects, important investments in future capabilities, were used to pay for other near-term expenses. Why did the agency decide to rob Peter to pay Paul rather than appropriately prioritizing in the first place? Perhaps the clues lie in the May 24, 2012 decision memo issued by Administrator Lipchenko when she states, the NWS operated with an unacceptable lack of transparency relating to budgeting and without mechanism for staff to air their concerns about budget formulation and execution within NWS, creating an environment of mistrust. Then there's the question of NWS oversight or lack thereof. The same memo also states that the investigative team that reviewed the financial mismanagement issues found failure of management and oversight by NWS leadership. In addition, the team found significant problems with budget and financial controls at the National Weather Service, and that department financial and management controls were ineffective at detecting or preventing this inappropriate reprogramming. Yet, despite this admission, NOAA and the Department of Commerce refused to provide an important witness for today's hearing. NOAA's Chief of Resources, Operations and Management, Crom, and former CFO during the events in question would have been able to provide a historical context for the funding issues the Weather Service faced, a description of the impediments of transparency she experienced as CFO, and a detailed understanding of what NOAA needs to do going forward to fully understand what happened and how it can be prevented in the future. The committee was willing to work with NOAA, even going as far as allowing the agency to only submit one piece of written testimony, but NOAA still refused. While I appreciate Dr. Sullivan's willingness to appear before the committee, denying the committee's request to hear from the person who was the agency's principal financial manager during a time in which millions of dollars of resources were secretly misallocated is simply unacceptable. This should be embarrassing for an administration that repeatedly declares itself the most transparent in history. The committee has also requested a number of documents from NOAA, some of which were originally requested months ago. Unfortunately, NOAA has not provided a number of resources that should be readily available. When an agency refuses to provide a witness as well as requested documents, it makes it difficult for us to conduct a thorough oversight. It also makes it difficult for us to not ask, what are you hiding? The committee will continue to track this issue as NOAA and the Department of Commerce attempt to identify the exact costs and impacts of these transfers, as well as how they plan to prevent it from happening in the future. Unfortunately, as the Commerce IG will mention in his testimony, allegations of similar behavior are still coming in, even as recently as last month. Now, as a former law enforcement officer, I understand that allegations have to be investigated thoroughly. But the simple fact that these complaints are still coming in tells me that NOAA and the department still have a problem on their hands. I look forward to all our witness testimonies and thank them for appearing today. The chair now recognizes Mr. Tonko for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I start with several statements of the obvious. The National Weather Service, or NWS, is a vital public safety organization, and the public greatly values the organization and its work. Congress authorizes and appropriates funds to federal agencies for specific purposes and has been supportive of the NWS and its mission. In light of this, the financial misconduct at the National Weather Service is shocking. There are well-established and widely understood processes for NWS to use if top management believes that funds must be reprogrammed. At their heart, those processes involve consulting with Congress. If you move money around without any accountability, as the former chief financial officer at NWS did, you are violating the Anti-Deficiency Act, a statute that clearly sets limits and penalties for spending money not authorized or appropriated by Congress. The power of the purse is enshrined for Congress in the Constitution, and for any senior official to ignore the law and the Constitution is a deeply troubling event. There are important investigative questions about what happened and why in the NWS, but the committee majority has expressed its preference not to release the investigative report produced by NOAA management to the public. The committee has not engaged in its own investigation to test the findings in that report to reach our own conclusions. This subcommittee has much more work to do before any of these questions could be answered. Instead, much of this hearing will be about the path forward for NWS and NOAA in ensuring that a future CFO cannot engage in systematic financial deception. That is fine as far as it goes. I think the proposals put forward by the agency make sense. However, I'm not sure we agree with this hearing's focus or scope. While there is no question that wrongdoing occurred at NOAA, just as troubling to me is the failure by the Inspector General's office at the Department of Commerce to take aggressive steps to investigate this matter. The IG is the cop on the beat, so to speak, at federal agencies. Congress empowers IGs with broad authority to investigate the inner workings of their agency, provides funding for investigative staff, and has established whistleblower protections for federal employees to try to encourage a culture where accountability is rewarded. The IG offices are vital partners in Congress's oversight responsibility. In this instance, the cop appears to have been taking a break and the partnership failed. Inspector General Zinsser has included in his testimony an accounting of the allegations his office received regarding financial irregularities at NWS and the disposition of those allegations. After receiving multiple tips, the IG's office recognized the potential problem. But the response to allegations of high-level financial shenanigans seems to have been to send those allegations back to the agency to ask them to check on their own misconduct. It seems counterintuitive to me that the best way to ferret out problems is to ask potential wrongdoers to investigate their own wrongdoing. Even the one preliminary investigation that was triggered by the hotline tips coming into the IG's office reveals something a little odd. That tip appears to have come in during October of 2010. However, Mr. Zinsser was unaware that his office had received the allegation, that his staff had launched a preliminary investigation, or that his staff believed an Anti-Deficiency Act violation had occurred until November of 2011, 1 year later. By the time Mr. Zinsser had seen his staff's memo, NOAA had already conducted its own preliminary investigation and had begun to take steps to remove the CFO from his post. And when it came time to launch a full investigation, the IG allowed the agency to conduct its own investigation. The IG's office was limited to offering investigative advice and questions to the team that NOAA put together. These procedures bear no resemblance to the conduct of an independent investigative office. Since the scandal broke, the IG has instituted a new system where allegations are aggregated each week and forwarded to a senior-level review team led by the IG himself. That is certainly a positive step. But for 5 years, his office did not do this. One has to wonder whether Other anonymous tips were ignored or sent back to the perpetrators with a recommendation that they investigate themselves. Finally, the IG has a mandate to inform Congress in a timely fashion of important agency misconduct and mismanagement. Yet, to my knowledge, the IG did not inform this committee or the Appropriations Committee that they had uncovered evidence of this apparent violation of law. This represents a real failing to follow the intent that the IG communicate with Congress about significant misconduct at their agency. There is no partnership where there is no communication. This is unacceptable. Madam Chair, I hope you agree that this committee deserves answers to our questions about what went wrong in the IG shop, as we rely on that office to be our eyes and our ears for wrongdoing. Congress has a responsibility to the taxpayer to not only allocate budgets to the agencies, but to ensure that allocated funds are spent wisely and in accordance with the law. I'm concerned that the Department of Commerce, IG, has failed to carry out that mission of his office, and I expect his full cooperation in helping us understand what they did, good and bad, and that he stand accountable for those actions. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. Now I'm going to introduce our first panel. This time, I'd like to let you know, introduce our first panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Katherine Sullivan, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction and the Deputy Administrator for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration at the United States Department of Commerce. Our second witness will be Inspector General Todd Zinsser of the United States Department of Commerce Office of Inspector General. As our witness should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. It is the practice of the Subcommittee on Investigation and Oversight to receive testimony under oath. Do either of you have, or do any of you have any objection to taking an oath?
No objection.
No objection.
Let the record reflect that all witnesses were willing to take an oath. You may also be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel here with you today?
I do not.
No.
Let the record reflect none of the witnesses have had counsel. If you would now please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record reflect that all witnesses participating have taken the oath. Thank you. I now recognize our first witness, Dr. Katherine Sullivan.
Thank you, Vice Chair Adams, Ranking Member Tonko, Mr. McInerney, and members of the committee. I want to start by thanking you for your support of NOAA and specifically the National Weather Service throughout the years. I know you join me in admiring the men and women of the Weather Service who day in and out provide the accurate, timely warnings and forecasts that protect lives and livelihoods across our nation. Unfortunately, I am here today to testify on misconduct in budget formulation and execution within the service. Before going further, I do want to stress a vital point. While the conduct was wrong and breached the trust between NOAA and this Congress, at no point did it compromise performance of our core forecast and warning mission. We first learned of the alleged misconduct in late November 2011. NOAA Administrator Dr. Dane Lubchenco notified then Deputy Secretary Dr. Blank and directed several immediate remedial actions. We put a government employee on administrative leave. We assigned the Chief Financial Officer from NOAA Fisheries to serve as the acting Weather Service CFO. Dr. Blank and Dr. Lubchenco launched an internal investigation led by myself as the senior NOAA official and a counterpart from the Commerce Department's CFO office. We also informed the Department of Commerce Inspector General of our intended investigation, and he agreed that an internal inquiry was the proper course of action. Finally, we notified the House and Senate Committees on Appropriations of both the allegations and our investigation. As we reported, upon conclusion of the investigation in May, we found that the Weather Service reprogrammed funds in fiscal years 10 and 11 without appropriate congressional notification. The mechanisms used were complex and undetectable by existing financial controls. We also found a significant lack of transparency and ineffective oversight of budget execution within the Weather Service. Importantly, as noted, we found no evidence of fraud or personal financial gain by any employee. We found further that the Weather Service had not actually operated in the red or as a whole with overspending its funds in a given year to accomplish its core mission. It did become clear, however, that the service did not have the right sums of money in the right accounts to support labor and operating costs. On May 25th of this year, Acting Secretary Blank and Dr. Lubchenco each issued a memorandum directing a set of corrective actions. These have been underway since that date. Dr. Lubchenco ordered 12 corrective actions, all designed to strengthen financial controls and increase transparency within the service, as well as to ensure no similar issues exist elsewhere in the agency. We directed changes in the Weather Service supervisory structure to strengthen oversight of the CFO by both the Weather Service Deputy AA and the NOAA CFO. We are creating a well-documented and transparent process to ensure that Weather Service budget formulation and execution are properly aligned and within the limits of appropriated funds. We strengthened the NOAA CFO's supervision over summary level transfers, one of the mechanisms used to execute the expense transfers inappropriately in this case. Lastly, we have awarded a contract to conduct an independent financial review and analysis of the Weather Service books going back to fiscal year 2006. In May, we worked with appropriators in both chambers to reprogram $36 million, the sum needed to sustain current levels of performance in our core forecast and warning services and avert the necessity of employee furloughs. This involved moving funds out of research and spare parts inventories and delaying some programs that support improvements for future years. The cuts were not easy, but few options remained open to us that late in the fiscal year. The exceptional performance of the Weather Service during Hurricane Isaac confirms that these have not negatively affected our current warnings and forecast performance. We are fully cognizant that it is imperative and incumbent upon us to restore sound financial management in the National Weather Service. We are committed to doing that and to keeping this committee informed of our progress. But even amid this immediate challenge, we must be looking toward the future and taking actions that ensure the long-term vitality and effectiveness of the National Weather Service. The National Academy study that the Congress requested is already guiding our thinking in this regard. We share the Academy's sense that the service must, and I quote, evolve its role and how it operates, making it more agile and efficient, close quote. And we look forward to the follow-on operations study directed by the CJS Fiscal Year 12 Conference Report, due in April 2013. We hope that in the coming months, our dialogue with the Congress, our employees, and our stakeholders can focus on the future, on how we all can work together to create that more agile and efficient organization, a National Weather Service for the 21st century that is, as the Academy says, second to none. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify on this very important matter. I welcome your questions.
Thank you. And I now recognize our second witness for the panel, Inspector General Todd Zinsser, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee, good afternoon. The invitation from Chairman Brown asked us to specifically address 4 areas. 1, identify how and when we received the allegations relating to financial misconduct at the National Weather Service. During the period June 2010 to August 2012, we received numerous complaints through our hotline or from GAO via their fraudnet. 8 concerned allegations of improper reprogramming, 4 concerned allegations about a former employee of the Weather Service Office of Chief Financial Officer who was brought back as a contractor. That person is now a former contractor, thanks to the Weather Service staff who contacted our hotline and Dr. Sullivan's prompt management action. 2, explain our role in and provide a preliminary analysis of the joint NOAA Departmental Investigative Report following NOAA's internal inquiry. I first became aware of allegations about improper reprogramming at the Weather Service in November 2011 when the head of our audit staff sent a memo to the Weather Service Chief Financial Officer and several other NOAA and departmental officials, which basically said that we thought they had a $10 million improper reprogramming issue concerning AWIPS funding and that they should get an opinion from the General Counsel's office. In our conversations with the Weather Service CFO's office during our review, they insisted that they had not engaged in improper reprogramming. We disagreed and said they needed to get the lawyers involved. A copy of our memo is attached to our written statement. At about the same time in November 2011, in a conversation with the former NOAA Deputy Undersecretary, I learned that NOAA was finishing up a review of similar reprogramming allegations that had been referred to them by my hotline staff. That report reached the same conclusion that we did, that there was improper reprogramming occurring. The issue was elevated very quickly to the Deputy Secretary and Undersecretary. There was interest in additional fact-finding, especially about the extent of executive responsibility and knowing the extent of the reprogramming, so initially NOAA, then the Department and NOAA jointly undertook further fact-finding between November 2011 and May 2012 when the report was issued and corrective actions ordered. 3. Explain the rationale for conducting a sufficiency review of the investigation rather than an independent OIG investigation. Generally, when we refer a hotline matter to the department or one of its bureaus for resolution, we ask for an answer. Once we receive the answer, we then conduct what we call a sufficiency review. We do not have the resources to look into every allegation we receive through the hotline, so this is a common method used by IG offices across the government to leverage our resources with those of the agencies to resolve management and administrative matters. In this case, it was my view that the Department and NOAA were in the best position to carry out the follow-up fact-finding for a few reasons. At the end of the day, the determination as to whether the reprogramming actions were proper or improper was going to be made by the Department and OMB, and the basic facts were already known. We had already reported our observations in our November 2011 memo, and it was now up to the Department and NOAA to address with their budget, accounting, and legal staffs. That put my office in a better position to then evaluate the Department and NOAA's actions in response. We are in the process of doing that right now. 4, discuss what follow-up activity OIG has planned. Both our audit and investigative staff are engaged in follow-up work. These activities are discussed in further detail in my written statement. Among other things, our audit staff is tracking progress on the 20 or so corrective actions that were directed by Acting Secretary Blank and Undersecretary Lubchenco. Our audit staff is also going to try to get a better handle on the reported structural deficit and budget shortfall referenced in the May 2012 report, which is said to underlie the improper programming. We would also like to get a better understanding of the impact, if any, of the reprogramming actions on the Weather Service programs, especially AWIPs. Our investigators are conducting follow-up interviews about how far back this may go and what other officials may have been aware of the structural deficit, the shortfall, and the reprogramming activities. The investigative work is also in response to hotline complaints received after the May 2012 internal report was issued. We will keep Congress informed and the Department informed of our work. This concludes my statement, Madam Chair. I would be happy to answer questions that you or other members of the subcommittee may have.
I thank the panel for their testimony, reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questioning. The chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Ms. Sullivan, Dr. Sullivan, you state in your testimony that you did not find evidence that NWS officials' improper actions put life or property at risk or jeopardized the delivery of timely or reliable weather forecasts and warnings. You also state that as part of the FY12 reprogramming, NOAA will take funds out of NWS accounts that will lead to postponing procurements of spare parts and deferring enhancements to weather systems, among others. How can you be sure that the future of NWS operations won't be impacted by these transfers? We've basically been eating our seed corn by taking money from programs like AWIPS and RIP. What does this mean to the future of NWS ability to deliver timely and reliable weather forecasts and warnings? And will the FY13 budget request be modified to reflect the current shortfall, or can we expect to revisit a scenario next year again where NWS either runs out of money or has to come back to Congress with more reprogramming requests?
Thank you for your question. We share your concern that we are taking from programs that underwrite the long-term future of the Weather Service to balance this out and make sure we support the current forecast. Across government, senior managers are wrestling with very much the same challenge: short-term urgent matters, longer-term investments under the tight fiscal constraints that we are all facing. We don't have a simple silver bullet answer, Madam Vice Chair. I would say in making the specific choices that we did make, both for the FY12 reprogramming and for the adjustments that we have proposed to FY13, we looked carefully at performance metrics in our key forecast and warning areas. We looked at rates of progress of those procurement programs. We made difficult, painful choices to slow rate of progress towards the future, not halt it, but slow it. and be sure that we sustain the performance that's so vital every day to the American public.
So are you saying that you don't believe that this will impact AWIPS or RIP?
We have restructured the Weather Radio Improvement Program only partly due to the reprogramming actions I've testified about today. There was separately and independent from that a very significant performance issue with the contractor that first was awarded that work some years ago. And thirdly, the development of AWIPS as it came along through the years and technology advanced showed the opportunity to accomplish the WRIP upgrade through the AWIPS system itself rather than by a separate standalone proprietary approach. So we have modified the approach to that program. The capability will come into service. On AWIPS, a couple of things are happening simultaneously. We are fielding an advanced AWIPS system called AWIPS 2. We've worked carefully to be sure that the adjustments that we've made in our budget do not affect the phased deployment of AWIPS 2. Above and beyond that, there are subsequent downstream enhancements that we have been working to prepare in software for their algorithms. Those enhancements are what we have had to slow to make these adjustments.
Thank you. You know, I know. Why, Mr. Zinsser, why didn't the IG's office assume responsibility for the investigation of NWS? Given how high up the allegations go, would it have made more sense to handle it at the IG level rather than provide a supporting role to the Bureau in the Department's investigation? I mean, I think that's, you touched on it in your testimony. I'd like a little bit more as to why.
Yes, Madam Chair. The fact that the initial complaint had been reviewed by our audit staff and by an internal team by NOAA that resulted in their November 11 report, taking those two things together established the basic facts. We both concluded that there was improper reprogramming going on. The additional fact-finding that the acting secretary was interested in dealt with whether the proper accountability had been identified among the executive ranks. My concern was that at the end of the day, a determination whether the reprogramming was improper, whether it constituted an Anti-Deficiency Act violation, that was all going to be determined by the Office of General Counsel and by OMB. At the same time, what I told the acting secretary was that I thought that they could go ahead and do the additional fact-finding. I had two concerns. One concern was that if there was any evidence that there was money going to somebody personally, that we would step in. The second concern was that if the people that they had to interview were of such rank that the interviewing team felt uncomfortable interviewing those people, that we would do that. And in fact, we have done that, and we continue to interview people and re-interview people that the initial fact-finding team have already talked to. That's going to be part of our follow-up review. So what I told the staff when we briefed them, your staff, was that there is a lot of work left to be done. But right now we have a good set of documents that the agency pulled together, and we have a lot of statements that have been made by various witnesses, and we're in a much better position to do the follow-up work that I think needs to be done.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I now recognize Mr. Tonko. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Zinsser, I think that you've taken good steps to fix the way your office handles hotline complaints, but would you agree or disagree that the system, the old system, was inadequate?
I definitely agree, and I think there are other factors involved, but there were some process improvements that were required that we put in place. Yes, sir.
And to that original system for handling complaints, that basically led your office to ignore important warnings about the Weather Service. And I worry about what else you may have missed. Have you done a risk assessment of what was missed, perhaps?
Yes, sir. While I'm While I'm not in agreement that we ignored the Weather Service, I don't think we pursued...
Well, you received whistleblower complaints.
Yes.
And nothing happened of that. Why would there not have been some sort of immediate response?
Well, the person that was managing my hotline operation at the time no longer works for me, so I can't go back and ask him. And other factors that existed at the time, I don't want to sound like I'm making excuses, but that was a period of time when the decennial census was operating. Our hotline was absolutely flooded, sir. But in any event, the risk assessment that we did do, what happened with that first GAO fraud net, what that staff member did was what we call zero-filed it. They cataloged it, they set it aside. So zero files are things that you're not going to take action on right away. You're going to file it. If additional complaints come in on the same subject, you have some history of the complaint. I would not have handled it that way, but my staff did. Now, we went back and looked at all the other complaints that we zero filed. And what I was told is that out of 500 or so, there were maybe 10 that weren't very well documented. I don't know that we would have acted any differently, but we really couldn't tell the rationale for why they were zero filed. But we have done a risk assessment, and we have put in place a number of process improvements. And we have provided training to the department. We've issued a guide on how to conduct these types of administrative reviews. We've established a community of interest in the department of anybody in the department that works on hotlines. I'm reporting on these on a quarterly basis to the acting secretary as part of our balanced scorecard. So we have strengthened, I feel, our whole process.
So as you evaluate what might have been missed, can I ask that we receive a copy of the evaluation of what was missed?
Sure, absolutely.
And Dr. Sullivan, we hear of the failure of this system, of an IG system, regardless of the human behavior or failure. It took that to draw attention to what should be a very obvious situation. A whistleblower or team of whistleblowers doing their thing. Is it credible that no one at NWS or no one knew of financial misconduct? It seems that there were numerous complaints. And can you convince me that the CFO at NWS was really the only senior person who knew what was going on? I mean, this is a major move of money. And am I to believe that it was just whistleblowers and then a failed IG response that we required when, in fact, the management of that situation should have been on top of it?
I would say, Mr. Tonko, our inquiry team, based on the witness statements that we took, really did find an unfortunate and quite ineffective management climate at the senior levels of Weather Service.
I'm told this goes back to 2006.
We have heard that anecdotally. Within the scope of our investigation, we couldn't verify that. That is why we've commissioned an independent evaluation by Grant Thornton to look back to FY 2006 and try to confirm that. There certainly were lots of what the assistant administrator of the Weather Service called griping. What he says in his statement he construed as normal carping of program managers who disliked the pressures that their budgets were on. Again, if you look at the details of the report, we found a budget formulation process that failed to bring forward in crisp and actionable fashion questions that clearly needed to be addressed more squarely. If we don't have sufficient funding to advance a program at a certain rate, what do we do about that? Meetings were held, PowerPoint charts were given, but in the instance cited, and I think it was 2010 in our report, with all of that chatter and chit-chat within the service itself, leadership at the Weather Service level did not bring together, force together, crystallize specific issues, specific risks, specific responses. They did not do that within the Weather Service and certainly did not bring any such justification or risk or warning forward to NOAA leadership. That's the only instance of such conduct I can speak to personally. It happened, we uncovered it and looked into it during our investigation. There may have been others previously before I arrived on station. I can't speak to those, but the one we did look at in our inquiry certainly says to me questions that needed answers, solid answers, well-developed budget justification and risk answers, were not being handled that way at the time within the Weather Service, and we're certainly not coming forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I now recognize Mr. Holtgreen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for both being here. I apologize for being a little bit late. Had a couple other meetings going on at the same time, but do appreciate your testimony. Do wanted to ask a couple questions. I'm not sure if this was covered in your oral testimony or not, but wanted just to clarify it. First of all, Dr. Sullivan, wondered just on timeline when we could expect the department to conclude its review to determine if Anti-Deficiency Act violations had occurred.
Thank you, Mr. Holtgren. It's my understanding that the preliminary determination has been concluded, and the matter is in the process of being referred forward to through appropriate channels to OMB and Justice, I presume. I confess to not being completely clear on the procedural details for that process, and that report and write-up should go forward perhaps as soon as the end of this week.
Okay, so you think we would start seeing those then in the next couple of weeks? Is that your thought?
Again, I'm not conversant with the procedural details that move these matters from a preliminary determination all the way through and bring them to the Congress's attention. But my understanding is there is a preliminary determination. I believe it is an affirmative one, and that the package is moving forward. Okay.
Also, Dr. Sullivan, are there several deadlines for action identified in the NOAA and DOC decision memos? Many of them had deadlines that have already passed. How many of those action items were completed by the listed deadline, and what are they?
The far majority of them, Mr. Holtgren, and I can give you a detailed listing of those. I'm sorry, I can't recount them to you one by one. You appreciate there's quite a number. We have been holding biweekly meetings on the progress of those actions at very senior levels. Both the Undersecretary and the Acting Secretary were briefed at the 90-day point on progress to date. There were many of the very early actions confirmed to be completed. There were none that I recall that were not underway or at an expected point of progress by that 90-day point, with I think one exception where, as the team investigated the actions needed to fulfill the order that was given, they found the scope was more complex than realized and requested permission to delay one milestone. But I would be happy to get you that full accounting.
If you would, that'd be great. If you can get that to our office and maybe also to the committee, that would be terrific.
We'll be glad to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Zinsser, just a couple questions for you. When do you anticipate completing your response to the investigative report?
Sir, we really have just begun, because part of that is to go and track the progress of and the sufficiency of the corrective actions that have been directed and that NOAA and the department are putting in place. We have reviewed the reprogramming request, for example, and spoke to the appropriators about that, and that was subsequently approved. And we've received one report that Ernst & Young performed for NOAA and the rest of the department on SLTs, about how the controls are or are not in place for the SLT mechanisms that are used in the accounting of for the budget. Beyond that, most of our work is still underway, and it's hard to determine, exactly how long we'll be. Plus, we're doing some follow-up interviews, and as you probably are aware, you really never know where those are going to lead you.
With your work, do you plan on issuing some sort of report or other documentation of the work that reflects what you're doing in the investigation that's ongoing now?
Yes, sir. We have opened a formal audit, made the announcement, and we will issue an audit report upon its completion. But during the course of that, we'd be happy to come up and brief the subcommittee and keep you informed on the progress. Okay,
and obviously we'd get copies of the report when that's completed. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Good. Also, Mr. Zinsser, in your testimony you identify a series of complaints that began in January 11th of 2012 relating to an NWS employee who allegedly promised funding for programs in return for hiring the employee's relative. Dr. Sullivan's testimony states that the investigative team found no evidence that the NWS employees committed fraud or received personal gain through their action. I wonder, based on your preliminary review of the allegations, do you agree with Dr. Sullivan's statement, or do you have any position on that?
Yes, I think the review that the Department of NOAA did focused strictly on the reprogramming issue. In that case, if you put aside the fact that a willful violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act could constitute a criminal act and be considered a fraud, you put that aside for now. The issues that we reported about these series of hotline complaints dealt with a conduct issue and a contracting issue inside that same Office of Chief Financial Officer at the Weather Service, and not directly about the reprogramming.
Okay. I think that sort of answers my question. But so you don't have any direct statement of whether you agree with Dr. Sullivan's statement on that or not, that there was no evidence of personal gain received by these employees?
I think that the issue involving the former employee and the contractor, I think he did improperly obtain personal gain, but not through the reprogramming effort. We didn't find any evidence in the reprogramming activities that money was going into anybody's pocket, for example. Okay.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Sullivan, when did the last summary level transfer take place?
Mr. McNerney, summary level transfers are commonplace financial management mechanisms. They're designed, their intent is to allow accounting officials to correct codes improperly entered inadvertently, really make technical level corrections. So they are a common and commonly used tool, both within NOAA and across the department widely. I don't know the precise answer, but I suspect it is probably within some recent days for legitimate accounting code corrections.
Well, how about improper programming? When was the last incident where improper programming took place?
I don't have specific evidence that allows me to answer that, Mr. McNerney. We put new controls and oversight measures into place effective August 1st that significantly change both the
August 1st of this year.
August 1st of this year in response to the corrective actions directed by Dr. Lubchenco.
Sir, if I may.
Yes.
The nature of these summary level transfers are such, and the way they were carried out was such, that NOAA and the department could not figure out which summary level transfers were appropriate and which ones were not appropriate. That's why it took them 5 months trying to nail down the transactions. There was no documentation on the transfers that were made, and the notations that were made in connection with those transfers were so cryptic that you didn't really understand the purpose of the transfers. And when Ernst & Young came in and looked at it, their first finding was there were no controls over this process.
So, Dr. Sullivan, has the improper programming had any impact whatsoever, either way, on the polar satellite procurements?
This reprogramming that we investigated within the National Weather Service, I am very confident has not affected that. A different organization with NOAA executes those programs.
Okay, I mean, you must be sensitive to how this hurts the case for asking for those kinds of program funds.
We're very sensitive to the concerns of the committee, the subcommittee, and the Congress at large, and we share them. And that is why a number of Dr. Lubchenco's corrective actions, as well as the acting secretary's actions, charged our teams with looking beyond the horizon of this investigation and digging in to confirm that anywhere in the department we did change controls, add controls, strengthen them to be sure that we had none of this happening and could have higher confidence that it could not happen across our other program areas.
Okay, Mr. Zinser, did I hear you correctly that you first heard on November of 2011 about the improper reprogramming?
Yes, sir.
Well, that's a little bit in contradictory of something else you said, that you allowed NOAA to conduct its own investigations because those departments were the most capable and the most ready to do those investigations. So that happened before November of 2011.
Yes, sir. There were actually two efforts by NOAA and the department. The first one NOAA did, and as a result of my staff referring a matter to them. I wasn't briefed on that until November of 11 either. It was after that, the follow-up review that was done by the department and NOAA between November of 11 and May 12, that's when I went through a decision process with the acting secretary about how best to handle that follow-on investigative or fact-finding activity.
So you had no say then, personally, in the decision to send those investigations back to the NOAA?
No, our process wasn't set up at that point for me to really get involved at that level of detail with the hotline program.
There's some inconsistency still. By November of 2011, it was clear that some misconduct had occurred by some very senior National Weather Service officials, and that your own staff made it apparent that those were in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. That's an act we take pretty seriously here in the Congress, and yet those allegations were sent back to the department, even though they involve possible criminal behavior. What does it take for the IG to declare that an investigation has to take place within your department?
Yeah, let me clarify that, sir. When we have a finding and we make a recommendation, the department does not have to pay attention to me. And so when we tell them we think there's an Anti-Deficiency Act violation...
Which department?
The Department of Commerce, any department with an IG. Our recommendations do not have to be accepted or followed by the department. And in the case of an Anti-Deficiency Act violation, the department itself, an OMB, makes a determination whether there was a violation or not. I can make my observation, I can make my recommendation, but until the department weighs in and agrees, that's when action is taken, not just based on the IG's views.
Well, my time has expired.
Thank you. And I believe we have enough time for a second round, so maybe you can follow up if you'd like on that. I now recognize myself, the chair recognizes myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Sullivan, as part of your testimony, you explained that of the $36 million FY 2012 reprogramming request, $29.9 million will be from NWS programs. Protecting lives and property is central to NOAA's mission, and NWS forecasting and warning is the primary line of office with that responsibility. Instead of further draining the resources of NWS, why doesn't the reprogramming request come from other non-NWS NOAA funds?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We made a few judgments in working on the reprogramming. One was that the service in which we'd had the failings should be the primary horizon in which we look to balance properly. For that reason, and also to be sure that we really understood what sums needed to be where in the Weather Service itself. Secondly, although the National Weather Service is a very frontline and top priority mission for NOAA, we are charged with quite an array of missions that are of great importance to the country. I don't want to get into some debate about which of our children we love the most. We're by design an integrated ocean and atmosphere agency with a range of science, service, and stewardship responsibilities that touch Americans every single day. There's importance, in our view, in all of them. We attempted to make a balanced decision and prevent further degradation in mission areas that have suffered, frankly, greater budget erosion in recent years than the Weather Service itself has.
By the reprogramming?
No, by
Okay,
other...
so again, you're taking and reprogramming funds, and you're doing it from MWS.
That's correct.
And so I would like to know what, if any, other programs could have sustained such reductions.
That sum was that is a very large sum to take across other NOAA program areas. And again, our first driver and view was that it was right to solve this problem within the service where the misconduct issues had occurred. That late in the year, that was not altogether possible to do due to the expenditure rate and execution pace of the Weather Service itself. And something on the order, if I recall the sum correctly, of $4.2 million we did turn outside of the Weather Service and take those cuts there.
Okay. And so when I asked you earlier about the reductions and everything else, and then my colleague asked you about the polar systems and stuff, so you're saying you believe that you have enough money to do what you need to do, even with the reprogramming, and a simple yes or no will
Within the
suffice.
National Weather Service?
Within NOAA. Yes or no? Because you're going to reprogram. So do you believe you have enough money?
We can operate at that level. Yes, ma'am. I don't think any of us feel we're living fully up to the missions that the American people expect of us.
So in saying that, I think that it's very concerning because we have allocated and appropriated funding, and it's taxpayers' money. And if you didn't need it in the first place and you can still do your mission, it's kind of concerning. Okay? The other question I have, in the fall of 2011, the Weather Service conducted an internal review of the allegations it received from the IG. The preliminary findings of that review led to NOAA placing an NWS employee on administrative leave and prompted a NOAA Commerce senior level review that began in December of 2011 and did not conclude until May of 2012. During that time, NOAA created a new position, the Chief of Resources and Operations Management, CROM, to oversee the enterprise functions such as finance, information technology, and administration. This position was filled by the then current NOAA CFO before the conclusion of an investigation into the management of NOAA finances. How was NOAA sure that it was not giving a promotion to someone who had turned a blind eye towards, or it was naively oblivious to, improper financial activity when it had not concluded its report at the time that they made this appointment?
By the time that appointment was made, Madam Chair, we had taken, we judged sufficient witness statements to offer a view that the misconduct was substantially confined, totally confined within the Weather Service itself. As I said earlier, we had indications from a number of the witnesses and events that we reviewed that the service was not bringing forward up the NOAA budget chain the kinds of indications, evidence, data.
But isn't it the responsibility of the CFO's office for establishing and assuring the adequacy of financial internal controls? And this person was there and then was promoted during your investigation. Is that not correct?
That is the timing, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Sullivan, I know that you've taken the situation at NWS very seriously. At the same time, I have to mention how outraged I am and shocked to learn that with relative ease, people were able to manipulate accounts in the way that they did. I still don't feel secure in what I'm hearing, how that could have happened. We talk about the funding shortages for labor that I'm told are in the order of 10 to 15 million a year. And that's not insignificant, but it does not explain the tens of millions of dollars that were moved around that were non-labor. In fact, material provided to the committee shows that the NWS was coping with a shortage of over 40 million in non-labor funding shortages. At any other agency, I would think funding shortfalls would lead to dropping some initiatives because there simply wouldn't be the resources to support them. But I get the impression that NWS did not do that, instead tried to keep everything going by moving money around. Why didn't NWS simply seek a reprogramming of funds to meet their financial needs, or even ask for a supplemental appropriation to fully fund what is needed to be done?
Mr. Tonko, I can't speak to what the intentions or motives or thought processes were of people who didn't bring such matters directly to me and raise them or through our CFO chain and raise them in a way that was open for discussion. Again, I think as the corporate board matters that we discuss in our investigative report make clear, the processes, budget formulation and review processes within the Weather Service itself clearly seem deficient to really grappling with those kinds of questions squarely and bringing forward crisp alternatives, risk-based alternatives, evidence-based alternatives for management consideration and action.
Well, when you do your budget request every year, that goes to NOAA. Am I correct?
Each line office makes a budget request that comes
Right.
up and is aggregated into the NOAA budget. Yes, sir.
That's for the NWS. And then to the Department of Commerce?
Correct.
And then finally to OMB?
Correct.
Which would then end up with formulating the President's request for Congress to take action. Would there be any reason to believe that NWS requests for funds after they've gone through all these offices, would be inadequate to fully fund all their priorities.
Again, Mr. Tonko, I can't think of both of my nonprofit career, my corporate career, and government career, I can't think of a time in any budget formulation process where each manager doesn't feel that the amount of money they really need to do the job they want to do the way they want to do it is less than is available in the total pot. It's commonplace everywhere. It's certainly commonplace in government. It is the challenge of managers at every level to make the best arguments, show the evidence of what can they do, what can they deliver, what are the risks if budgets don't conform to the requests that they've made, and when final budget allocations are made at any of those levels, including by the Congress, to adapt and adjust their operation to conform with that direction. It's always a challenge, but it's a common challenge everywhere through government.
And when it came to the CFO, was there any reason to believe that anyone advised him that, or encouraged him that they should do this fungible thing and move the dollars around?
The Weather Service CFO? Based on the materials we garnered in witness statements, I cannot recall, which would have been hearsay or speculation as to his motives in any case, but I don't recall any of our witnesses opining on their views of his motives, and I have no personal contact with that individual at which he made any statements to me, so I couldn't speculate to that.
Can we imagine any motivation to put one's career at risk or reputation or integrity on the line simply to balance an agency's budget? What would possess a CFO to take such a bold stand?
It defies my imagination, Mr. Tonko, and further understanding the critical importance of trust to the mission and performance and effectiveness of the National Weather Service overall. It defies my imagination that someone would do something that might even faintly go outside of the law for any reason.
Well, the failure at the department and then the ignoring of the whistleblowers by the IG and the lack of quick and ready response by the IG are all discouraging, and I look forward to additional information that will be exchanged with the committee. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I know that the committee is looking forward to some information also. I think that you've been asked, your agency has been asked for a dozen or so of materials requested months ago, including the CFO council minutes and program oversight briefing, so hopefully you can get that provided to the committee as soon as possible.
We are working on that, Madam Chair.
Hopefully it will be done fairly quickly.
That is my hope as well, ma'am.
I'd like to thank the panel for their valuable testimony. The witnesses are excused, and we will move to our second panel. And Dr. Sullivan, if you could ask them to please get it to us before we come back next month, it would be awesome.
I will pass that request and add my urgings. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll get started with our second panel. The first witness on our second panel is Dr. William Gale, the Chief Technology Officer of the Global Weather Corporation, who serves on the committee on the assessment of the National Weather Services Modernization Program at the National Research Council of the National Academies. The final witness on our second panel is Mr. Richard Hearn, General Counsel and Legislative Director, National Weather Services Employees Organization. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. It is the practice of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight to receive testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objections to taking an oath?
No.
Let the record reflect that all witnesses were willing to take the oath. Take an oath. You may also be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel here with you today?
No. No.
Let the record reflect that none of the witnesses have counsel. If you would now please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Let the record reflect that all the witnesses participating have taken the oath. I now recognize our first witness, Dr. Gale, to present his testimony.
Madam Chair, committee members, and colleagues, thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. My name is Bill Gale. I am co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of Global Weather Corporation, a provider of precision weather forecasts to businesses within the energy, media, transportation, and consumer sectors. We are a successful startup in today's economy because quality weather information is increasingly needed by businesses to serve customers and improve operations. I'm speaking to you today in my role as a member of the committee that produced the report, Weather Services for the Nation, Becoming Second to None, issued by the National Research Council and the National Academy of Sciences. The Weather Service modernization of the 1990s produced major improvements to our nation's weather observing systems and to the Weather Service structure. It was primarily a response to an internal lack of modernization over several decades. The committee felt the Weather Service successfully learned most lessons from the modernization and has since continued to modernize. Today's challenges are no less important, but they are largely external challenges reflecting the ever-evolving user needs and technology context of our society. The first of these challenges is keeping pace with advances in science and technology that are taking place around the Weather Service. The second challenge is meeting society's expanding needs for better weather information. The third challenge is effectively partnering with and supporting the larger enterprise to achieve the greatest public benefit. Meeting these key challenges will require the Weather Service to evolve its role and how it operates. The goal is for it to become more agile and effective. Our report presents 3 main recommendations for accomplishing this. Our first recommendation is that the Weather Service should refocus on its core capabilities. These include creating foundational data sets, performing essential functions such as forecasts and warnings, and conducting operationally related research. All are needed for the Weather Service to perform its central role of protecting lives and property, and for it to support the enterprise as a provider of additional services. In executing this recommendation, the Weather Service will need to prioritize those things only it can do and avoid replicating capabilities where there are viable alternatives. Our second recommendation is to update Weather Service function and structure. The current Weather Service structure reflects needed functions of the 1990s. Technology has changed much of the rationale for the present Weather Service organizational structure. The committee was aware that Congress has requested a separate external review of Weather Service function and structure, so we chose to limit our detailed recommendations in this area, but noted that any such study requires significant technical input. Our third recommendation addressed the need to better leverage the larger enterprise providing weather services and systems. The relationship between the Weather Service and the rest of the enterprise has improved considerably since the modernization, with praise deserved by all parties. Improved leveraging of the enterprise enhances the Weather Service's ability to serve the nation. This is especially important at a time when the Weather Service seeks to enhance its services subject to constrained resources. Better weather information can save both lives and be a growth engine for the economy. A recent study showed that variability in U.S. economic output due to weather-related supply and demand inefficiencies is more than 3% of GDP. In some states, it is over 10%. A significant portion of this can be recovered as economic growth through improved weather information. I would like to provide 2 examples from my own company's experience that illustrate the importance to our nation of both the Weather Service and the committee's recommendations. The Omaha World-Herald News Group, owned by Berkshire Hathaway, has recently acquired nearly 100 small and mid-sized newspapers. Their vision is that newspaper companies are not dying, but rather the best source of critical local information, which will be delivered increasingly over web and mobile. Accurate weather forecasts are often the most important information they provide to these smaller communities. Xcel Energy is the off-taker utility for 10% of America's wind farm capacity. Starting in 2009, Xcel privately funded research and development focused on improving the accuracy of wind forecasts. Operational use of this system saved $7.9 million for Xcel ratepayers in 2011 alone. In both examples, commercial weather companies are helping to implement the vision, but Weather Service foundational information is essential to making it possible. In summary, meeting today's challenges will require changes at the Weather Service over as much as a decade. Our recommendations will help make the Weather Service more agile and effective. In a constrained resource environment, this approach makes possible benefits to the nation beyond what the Weather Service budget alone allows. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize our second witness for his testimony on the panel, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ranking Member Tonko, thank you for inviting me to present the views of the National Weather Service Employees Organization and the 3,700 Weather Service employees we represent nationwide. The Weather Service budget shortfall should not have come as a surprise to the leadership of NOAA as it did earlier this year when an emergency reprogramming request was submitted. Although the amount and cause of the structural shortfall is an open question, its existence was well documented and public knowledge. In January 2005, the director of the Weather Service delivered a PowerPoint presentation to the American Meteorological Society that showed a cumulative funding gap that began in FY 2001 and that had grown to $37 million. In February 2005, the Weather Service budget director also told the Washington Post that the agency had a cumulative shortfall of $37 million that stemmed from chronic underfunding. In April 2006, DOC had to submit a reprogramming request to add $13 million to the local warnings and forecasts baseline to, quote, sustain operations and avoid a nationwide hiring freeze. By 2008, the Weather Service had increased its lapsed labor rate to nearly 5% in order to mitigate the shortfall. In other words, the Weather Service intentionally delayed filling vacancies so that 5% of all Weather Service positions were vacant at any given time. On December 3, 2008, I and other NWSEO representatives met with the NOAA transition team for the incoming administration. Both team members with whom we met would later be appointed to senior leadership positions in NOAA. We presented them with some of the documents on the shortfall that we had been previously provided by Weather Service, including a spreadsheet showing that the Weather Service anticipated an annual shortfall of $30 million through FY13. Thus, the incoming administration was clearly told of the substantial financial problem left them by the outgoing administration. In her recent appearance before the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Subcommittee, the Undersecretary testified that the Weather Service is not operating with insufficient funds. This assertion is refuted by nearly a decade's worth of evidence to the contrary. Now, over the years, the Weather Service has erroneously attributed the structural shortfall to growing labor costs, which they say has outstripped increases in agency appropriations. But between 2002 and 2012, the salary rates of most Weather Service employees rose 27%. However, during the same 10-year period, the amount appropriated for the local warnings and forecast base line item, the line item for which 90% of all employees' salaries are paid, rose by 31%, and overall funding for NWS operations rose by 34%. In other words, the general salary rates, which have not grown faster than the funding for NWS operations, and employment levels at the Weather Service have been essentially flat since 2005, authorized at slightly over 4,600 employees. Now, also in her recent testimony to the House Appropriations Committee, the Undersecretary stated that the Weather Service needs to evolve into, quote, the most efficient and cost-effective manner in face of changing budgets. This year, the administration proposed to eliminate 122 personnel at local forecast offices as a first step, a proposal that was soundly rejected in a bipartisan fashion by both the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee and by the full House, all of whom restored funding for these critical positions. Staffing reductions are simply not an option for mitigating the Weather Service structural shortfall. The 122 forecast offices operate 24/7, and most of the time there are just 2 forecasters on duty who have responsibility for protecting the lives of nearly 3 million people on average. Last year's National Research Council's retrospective assessment of the Weather Service modernization recognized that forecast offices are staffed only for fair weather, and that staffing is at precariously low levels during severe weather. Staffing levels are continuing to remain at dangerously low levels because the Weather Service and the NOAA Workforce Management Office now delay filling vacant operational and emergency essential positions for 6 months or more, leaving offices critically understaffed. Finally, it is important to note that although the number of federal employees has grown over the past decade, employment levels at the Weather Service have remained stagnant. In fact, there are approximately 15 fewer Weather Service employees and only half as many offices as there was 20 years ago. Thank you.
I thank the panel for their testimony, reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Mr. Hearn, the term structural deficit has been used in different ways depending on the perspective of the speaker. Can you please explain what a structural deficit is from the perspective of the union? Is this deficit a result of insufficient planning, for yearly wage increases, for salary?
We don't think it can be primarily attributed to insufficient salary planning because, as I've noted, the salary levels have gone, the salary rate, general schedule salary rates have gone up certainly no more than the Weather Service appropriations. And when we say structural deficit, we're just using the terminology that the Weather Service management through this previous administration and several Weather Service directors and CFOs previous have used, laid out in all their charts and spreadsheets, which we have provided the committee, listing what programs and what essential operational things are not being funded, what maintenance is being delayed, what procurement's not taking place. It's been pretty much laid out by the Weather Service. This is not our terminology. And those details have been provided to the committee in hard copy.
Thank you. Mr. Gale, will the Weather Service continue to be second to none if it does not continue to support investments in science and technology?
It's essential that these investments are supported, absolutely.
And to both of you, a large portion of the Weather Service's budget is devoted to labor. Mr. Hearn's testimony indicates that forecasting centers are already running on skeleton crews. The Academy's recent report stated that as scientific and technological progress continues, critical components within the NWS are lagging behind the state of the science. Understanding current budget realities, what advice would you provide Congress on how to address this predicament? Mr. Hearn and then Mr. Gale. Dr. Gale.
Well, what we supported what Congress did last year, and that is call for an outside study of the Weather Service structure, its operations, and its needs for the future. We have worked with the National Research Council this year and the previous year on their study. We think that it has to be a nationwide dialogue to first establish what job the Weather Service is going to be doing, what new capabilities it can engage in the future before a long-range plan can be set. But at a very minimum, the structural deficit may be in the realm of $30 million. There needs to be an adjustment in the FY14 budget, if not in the FY13 budget.
Dr. Gale.
Yeah, we agreed that there are efficiencies that can be gained within the Weather Service in terms of better utilization of technology. Technology is evolving rapidly, and those can be used to improve the quality of the forecast. At the same time, we said that the human element of the forecast is essential, and as technology evolves, humans can play different roles in performing those forecasts, focusing on those areas where they contribute most, focusing on use of automation in areas where automation can be used best. In addition, we said that the Weather Service has the ability, working with the broader enterprise, to create leverage in terms of value that is generated for the nation, using the private sector, using other entities that work with the Weather Service closely and can perform roles in providing benefits to both businesses and the public in terms of enhancing what the core Weather Service capabilities are. But it does come back to making sure that those are protected.
Thank you. And Mr. Hearn, what was the reaction from NWS, NOAA, and or DOC leadership to your efforts to inform them about the structural deficit and to your recommendations on how best to address it?
I can only say that it was ignored. Had the incoming administration relied on our advice or had at least taken us seriously with the information we provided them, this whole reprogramming problem, unauthorized reprogramming problem that we've had over the past 2 years would never have happened, because the problem would have been fixed 2 or 3 years ago had they gone back and the new administration, in their budget request to Congress, had fixed the structural shortfall. And we have every confidence that Congress would have approved it, because anything that the Weather Service has asked for basically has been approved by, have gotten bipartisan support from Congress.
Thank you. I yield back the rest of my time, and I now recognize Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Some people may think the weather can just be grabbed off the television, or forecasts are churned out by computers. So, Mr. Hearn, can you clarify for the members of the committee the role of forecasters in the work over at NWS?
Wow, that's a big job, but I'll just give as capsule summary as I can say. Basically, twice a day, based on weather data gathered by weather balloons, satellites, observation centers, there are computer models, a number of computer models with what's called synoptic forecasts that are produced here in Maryland at the National Center for Environmental Prediction, goes out to the forecast offices, 122 forecast offices nationwide. Those model forecasts are pretty broad scope and need to be tweaked, changed, adapted to the local communities based on the knowledge and expertise of the local forecasters, who put out several times a day marine, aviation, public, all kinds of forecasts that we rely upon directly to the public, to the press, to the private companies rely upon. And as they're doing that, as they're watching the weather, adopting these models, tailoring them for the local needs, they're also keeping the eye on the weather for developing severe weather. And then when severe weather develops, while they're doing these forecasts, they often have to call in extra staff, because no two people can do this on their own, monitor the radar, get the spotter reports, and issue the warnings and watches of tornadoes, severe thunderstorms, blizzards, flash flooding that we see in the media. So they're doing two things at one time. They're adopting the model forecast for to specify it for the local communities, and they are also keeping an eye on the weather and then teaming up when necessary to issue warnings of severe weather.
Thank you. The National Academies highlight the role of technology in empowering the NWS to do even better work than they do now. So, Dr. Gale, do you see embracing new technology as a labor-saving exercise, or is it that technology and labor levels don't necessarily connect in terms of a savings, or is it just getting even better work out of the process? Is there a labor impact from the investment of technology in your mind?
Well, the human work that is done now is a combination of highly skilled things and more routine things. And as with any industry, automation can step in and support on the more routine aspects of things that are done and free up that human labor to be applied where it's most needed in the judgment area, in the areas where you're trying to discern things that may not have been seen before, a particular set of conditions that seem somewhat unique, and yet the ability to create a forecast based on that knowledge is still critical to public safety. And so better applying the human judgment, the human capabilities where they can do the most good, I think, is where technology will be able to help most.
So it's freeing up some of the labor to do the more judgmental or interpretive outcomes.
Well, I think one of the things that's important to realize is that this is not a static situation. The demand for these kinds of things is increasing rapidly, both on the business side that I see within my company and on the public safety side, as we see in terms of vulnerability to severe weather and things like that. So there's a demand that certainly will not be met in the future unless we really progress rapidly, both in terms of our scientific and technology capability, but also in terms of applying the human resources appropriately.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Hearn, in 45 seconds, can you offer any observations
yes,
there?
To answer that, there is an increasing demand for the Weather Service to engage in what's called decision support services, to have our forecasters work with directly face-to-face local emergency management personnel during severe weather events. We now have forecasters go out to the all out west to all the wildland fires and do forecasts on the spot, face-to-face with the firefighting crews, to the extent that better computer models and technology can free up time so that our folks can be more involved in these decision support services to the emergency management communities. We really are looking forward to that. And in fact, it was at our request and our design that the Weather Service has now started several pilot programs around the country by adding an emergency response meteorologist to forecast offices whose primary job is more social science and interrelation with emergency managers to bring the product out, to make sure people are aware of the product, to help the local communities and the emergency managers make better decisions based on the weather information. The union has been the one that designed those programs, convinced the agency that they were needed, and we jointly designed and are experimenting with that several places around the country.
I can tell you, having been impacted in our district, Congressional district, with severe storms over the last year, I can tell you the communities and the individuals that I represent could strongly endorse that kind of connection. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. The witnesses are excused, and the hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We agreed everything you said. We're in the same way.